So I'm Lowri Evans. I'm a senior advisor to Shearwater Global. And before I did this, I was a Director General in the European Commission, and notably DG Grow. David?
Yeah, I'm David Martin. I'm also a senior advisor at Shearwater, former member of the European Parliament and former Vice President of Parliament, mainly concentrating on constitutional and trade type issues, and looking forward to this discussion on where we go from here after the European elections.
Excellent. And I think we're going to be controlled today by Coco, the real face of Europe.
Good morning, afternoon all. I'm Coco Carmona, partner at Shearwater. Delighted to be here at the first Shearwater webinar. We will be discussing EU elections. We will be discussing surely what happened yesterday evening. And I'm honored to have you both speak today. We have been speaking in the Brussels bubble and beyond about what happened 2 weekends ago. I'm sure there are still things left unsaid, but I would like to kick off the discussion today with your views of what it would appear to be a very apocalyptic scenario. It didn't materialize as such, at least this is what I feel, but I would be interested in hearing your views, please.
Yeah, certainly. The prediction in advance was that the far right, the hard right, was going to sweep the boards and the centre was going to be squeezed. Well, actually, the outcome of the elections is that the centre is actually very marginally bigger, not smaller, than it was the so-called three big groups, or in the past the big groups, the European People's Party, the Socialists and Democrats, and the Renew or Liberal group. Between them have gone from, as I say, a very marginal gain, but gone from about 59% of the parliament to just over 60%, with still a number of MEPs, new MEPs, to decide where they're going to sit. So that percentage could go up higher. I think a reasonable analysis of the election result would be that this was a challenge to incumbents rather than a march of the far right. So what we saw was Macron suffering in France, the coalition in Germany suffering. And even in Italy, strangely enough, although Meloni increased her own vote, there was a decline of the right in total, because Salvini's group actually went from, incredibly, in the last European elections, they got, I think it was 34%, but well over 30%, and they're down to well under 10% this time. So even in Italy, although it looks like a victory for the right, it was a reorganization of the right votes. What all this means is that if the three big groups can cooperate, and we'll come on to discussing this, I'm sure, but if the three big groups can cooperate, then Parliament can function pretty effectively and get through mainstream policies and politics.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just a small compliment. I think relative to expectations, I would say that the EPP and the Socialists did better than perhaps people expected, and they're still, quite considerably by far the largest two groups. But there were two, in a way, losers, big losers, but from relatively smaller numbers than that. Renew lost, and the Greens lost, I would say. So in terms of the flavour of the centre, David, I think that's not an insignificant change for the next legislature.
Yeah.
And yet, European leaders seem to have failed to acknowledge the results of the election. So some of the leaders think, apparently, from what happened yesterday evening, with President Meloni being one of the cause that leaders did not make final informal decisions yesterday evening. How do we read that? And how do we see the influence of the capitals going forward after the elections?
It's interesting, because I think what happened yesterday perhaps shows a different sort of split on the centre to far right, in that I get the impression that Meloni, particularly because of the way she behaved yesterday, wants to influence what's happening at the European level. Whereas other aspects of the far right, for easy description, the Orbanist types, not all the Hungarians, but the Orban types want to be disruptors. They want to spoil the party, as it were, make Europe difficult to operate and to organise. Whereas I think Meloni, not in terms of policies, but in terms of decision making, wants to be closer to the mainstream, and that's going to be a very interesting problem going forward, because this gets us back to the question of, do the EPP, the centrist centre-right group, work with the socialists and the Renew group, or will they be tempted to go to the ECR, where Meloni and her colleagues sit, or not Meloni personally, but where her colleagues sit? And that's going to be an interesting dynamic in the next parliament, because the EPP are tempted by Meloni, if they're wooed by her group, and some indications were that last night at government level they were, that could be very dangerous in terms of getting coherent decision making. What clearly happened was Meloni said, and the EPP said, we've won the election, and yes, we'll give the socialists something because of the second biggest group, but this idea of splitting the council presidency into 2.5 years, so the socialists only got 2.5 years of a presidency in all the 3 presidencies that were up for grabs, was clearly a bit of a power grab, which I think is dangerous for cooperation in the future if this is repeated. It may just be a one-off show. Come the formal council, there may well be agreement that we move forward with the original package that was presented of a EPP President of Parliament Commission, Liberals getting the foreign policy dossier, and the Socialists getting the chair of the council.
Lowri, would you agree? Would you say that there will be surprises going up to the next summit on the 27th June?
Just to answer the last bit first, I'm sure they will decide next time. So I think this is a little bit personally of drama. To go back to your original question, the influence of capitals, we answered your first question by aggregating the European results and giving you the EU picture. But of course, all politics is more local than that, really. So there were 2, I would say, winners in terms of prime ministers, heads of state, and they were indeed Giorgia Meloni, and I would add to that Donald Tusk. They reinforced their domestic and political power, I think, with the EU election results. And there were 2 losers, right? Emmanuel Macron, and I would add to that Olaf Scholz. So that does change a little bit the dynamic in the European Council. And I think this explains partially why Giorgia Meloni was cross. I think at an individual head of state level, you know, she expected some of her peers to acknowledge that she'd done really well, and they didn't do it. So there's a psychological dimension to that. But at the end of the day, the ECR that she represents, just like David said, is not a major player. So they will have to find a way to square this emotion and find something for Italy, but it could be also within the Commission, so within the gift of Ursula von der Leyen, right? But it still has to be balanced, because anything too visibly too pro-ECR, too pro-Giorgia Meloni risks alienating the absolute majority in the parliament, and that is the #1 game.
Would you agree, David? Yes.
Very, very much so. And this is the last point that Lowri made is an interesting dynamic, because, as you know, the positions in the parliament, when we start to get down to committee chairs, is a very important position to hold. And it's done on the basis of what's called the D'Hondt system. So the biggest group gets the first choice, and then their number of seats halves, and you go down a list. And as the groups stand, and there's still 40 odd members to decide where they're going to sit, but as the groups currently stand, ECR will either have the 4th or the 5th choice in the parliament, which means they could go for a very big committee and quite a sensitive committee. And if that, as Lowri says, is a kind of payoff to Maloney, that might work well at the heads of state level, but many people in the Parliament will find it, unless they're very, very subtle about who they choose for that position, many in the Parliament will find it difficult to vote for an ECR person in a sensitive dossier. And that then, once you get one position unraveling, everything can start to unravel if you're not careful. And so it's going to be, the whole negotiation is going to be very, very delicate. A lot of this has to be supposition, because MEPs are only arriving for the first time in Brussels yesterday and today, so they haven't even discussed this among themselves. But it looks like if von der Leyen and the package that Lowri has outlined is agreed, that Parliament will vote for von der Leyen as President of the Commission. What is not so clear is they'll vote for her Commission once the package is put together, once the commissioners are decided. And I've seen this happen before, but it could even be more tense this time if the left reject a certain commissioner, then the right almost, as a point of principle, find out a left commissioner to object to, and then you get into this tit for tat. And it's never been good in the past, but given the new balance in the Parliament, it could be quite dramatic and quite damaging.
So going back to the policies and the results of the EU elections, everybody's celebrating the shift to competitiveness, industrial agenda, etc. But is the right really good for business and EU business, non-EU business, sorry, and trade? What are the repercussions of that shift to the right, looking into a more sovereign EU agenda?
Well, I mean, firstly, again, as you well know, Coco, it's the Commission who set the legislative agenda. So a lot will depend on who's in what portfolio inside the Commission, firstly, what they bring forward. For example, let's take environment just as a random example. If we get a Green Commissioner or a Renew Commissioner or an S&D Commissioner in the Green portfolio, they're likely to want to be quite activist. If, to take an extreme, very unlikely extreme, but say the Hungarians got the Green portfolio, the environment portfolio, you might end up with a commissioner who doesn't want to put any legislation forward whatsoever. So firstly, we don't know what the legislative train is going to be like till we get a better idea of who's in the Commission. But to answer your question in terms of the Parliament, I think in general, and again, it goes back to this point about whether the Maloney representatives, the Brothers of Italy, are going to be constructive members of the Parliament or not. I think in general, this will be a reasonably pro-business Parliament, reasonably in favour of policies on competitiveness. Trade will be interesting. I find it quite hard at the moment to really work out where we're going to go in trade, because certain elements in the EPP are quite anti-China and quite protectionist when it comes to China, but the same group are generally quite liberal in terms of trade. So I don't know which of those dynamics will play out, and that applies mostly across the centre and the right of the Parliament. There's a tension between wanting to control China and Chinese investment and Chinese access to our market, and generally being ideologically pro free trade. So it's a tension that only time will tell how it will work out.
Yeah, I agree again. This is very boring that we both agree on every aspect, so I'll just try to complement that. I think that the legislative agenda is indeed set by the Commission. But if we cast our minds back to the beginning of this ending political cycle, the tone of this political cycle was set very much by the promises that Ursula von der Leyen made to get the absolute majority in the Parliament. So even though the political landscape is sort of EPP dominated, the Socialists and the Greens last time round had an almost disproportionate influence because of that. And the shift is that the Greens aren't there now, but the Socialists still are. So I'm very interested to see how or whether the socialists in the parliament have evolved in terms of their greenness, and they may have. Yeah, we will. It's true. My crystal ball doesn't tell me that. David's might do. But let me say something when I was looking at the data, the Commission as legislative initiative institution is going to be a lot more EPP next time than this time, because 11 out of 27 commissioners, that includes von der Leyen now, are presently EPP. And there will be a lot more than half. We can, speculate on the number, but more than half within the Commission will be EPP commissioners the next time, because we know that in the last 5 years, the shift to the right has happened in terms of who decides which commissioner to send. So, that can have a quite significant influence, to go back to David's reminder of who has the power of initiative here. But, the overall tone is going to be absolutely set by the European Parliament. Logistics of approving Mrs. von der Leyen, I would predict, as the next president.
And as a result, you said Greens are not there anymore, or not as much as they were last mandate, but von der Leyen would need to seek support from one side or the other. Is it true to say that the Greens will no longer be there in substance? I have mixed feelings about that.
There's only 52 of them. There's only 52 of them.
Yeah. In terms of von der Leyen's position, I don't think they're going to be players. I think that will, I think they'll be marginalised. I think where they can come back into play, even with only 50 odd members, is when we get down to the legislative detail. And a lot, again, I know it sounds strange, but a lot of this does depend on personalities, who ends up chairing what committee in the Parliament, what the personal relationships are, who gets the key rapporteurships and such like things. And if the Greens, to take an earlier point you made, Coco, if the Greens can build up a relationship with the new socialist group, and for example, the French are now more influential in the socialist group than they were in the last Parliament, and they tend to lean towards the Greens, then there could be a dynamic there between the Greens and the socialists. But we don't yet know, and again, it's personalities, we don't yet know who's going to lead the socialists. And just to give our guests a flavour of how volatile all of this is, I mean, last week, by a very senior person in the socialist group, I was told that the current leader of the socialist group had no chance of being leader again. On Friday, by the end of the week, I was told she was a shoo-in to be leader of the group by the same person. And then yesterday, Monday, I was told that the Italian delegation, which is now the biggest delegation in the group, hadn't actually met all 20 together yet, and indeed are meeting as we are meeting right now, and they might change their mind and they might go for the leadership of the group, and the current leader of the socialist group might be made vice president of the Parliament in the second half of this Parliament. So, I mean, I know our guests are looking for a strong direction in which way things are going, but it's also important to say that things are very, very volatile at the present time. But the point of all of that about the socialist group, if the current leader remains leader, then I think she has built up, it's been tense, but she's built up a working relationship with Weber, the EPP leader, and that will carry on. If it's an Italian, it will then depend on which Italian. But in the last Parliament, the Italians were less green friendly than other delegations inside the socialist group. And so, for example, on packaging, they were more business-ish friendly than some of the Greens and some of the rest of the socialist group. So there's a lot to play for in terms of who gets what position, and the key thing will be, once we know who's in the key positions, is to start working directly with them, trying to understand their attitude and how we can influence them and how we can move them in a useful direction.
Going back to policies again, we touched about industrial policy and the EU strategic agenda, which is regardless of who will be holding the top jobs. I don't think it's going to go away. So will that impact or continue to impact competition policy portfolios? Lowri, you played a leading role when you were in the Commission in DG Comp. Do you see this as moving towards more state aid? How do you see it going forward? If the tendency continues, that is.
Okay. Well, on substance, I think they will have to carry forward what this Commission has done very well, in my personal opinion, which is to have a really good focus on resilience or sovereignty, whatever you want to call it, in terms of supply chain dependencies, right? That was overdue, and it's absolutely necessary because of what we all now better understand as the position of China as a competitor for Europe and the US and the world. And it was even more important once we understood much better about energy after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So those are the two big things that are still absolutely right and center for the next political cycle as well. State aid as such is not a huge piece of the jigsaw. I think that what happens much more is regulatory decisions. So, for example, if we are going to make huge advances in terms of energy security, electrification is one of the big dimensions of that. And arguably, the thing that's holding investment in grids and electrification back is lack of progress on planning. And those are completely domestic issues. So addressing issues like that are domestic constraints, is nothing to do with money. Yeah? It's to do with the business certainty and actually the speed of enabling investment by the private sector. So I would put that much, much higher. So people are obsessed by state aid because it's at the EU level that the decisions are taken, in sovereign terms, whether to accept national governments subsidizing their own industries or not. But the state aid politics is usually much more about what Germany and France want to do rather than the 27 member states, because half of the state aid that's out there is usually French and German. And then if you add in Italy and Spain, the top four, you get to more than 70%. So the politics is about what the centre lets the big four do, big two really, and anything they let them do is to the detriment of the single market as a whole, and perhaps the EU behaving as a continent in economic terms. And that is probably more important. But that's a very deeply held ideological, personal and professional view.
The Franco-German axis is important. So what is happening in those two countries will influence very much the direction.
That's been since the dawn of time for the European Union and the European community.
Yeah, but I know we always get stories, as Lowri kind of hints at, about how that's breaking down and it always seems to survive. But actually, for the moment, there does seem to be a deeper malaise between Macron and Scholz, and they don't seem to get on at all. And it's not just a matter of personalities; it's about the direction of Europe as well. So there is a potential difficulty there, and again a gap for people to fill. And Macron, of course, is going to have his eyes elsewhere on domestic issues for the next month or so when some of these key decisions are being made. So Spanish could play a more significant role. Again, Maloney is clearly looking to try and fill some of that gap. And perhaps one or two of the smaller member states might see this as an opportunity to have more influence than they normally have. But my own guess is, in the long run, of course, the Franco-German axis will the motor will go again, and they will start to play the key roles inside the European Union. There's just one thing I wanted to add to Lowri about the competitiveness. I think we shouldn't ignore, in terms of, as an example of how we might work towards more resilience, the European Chips Act, where we are trying to encourage the production of chips inside the European Union. And that's, it doesn't sound very dramatic, but it's quite, compared to recent times, in fact, compared to the whole history of the European Union, it's a rare example of the EU actually taking the decision to target a specific product and to ensure that it's produced inside the European Union. And I can't think of a definite example where we might follow suit, but for example, batteries for cars, electronic batteries, might well be a second branch to that. So you may see, you're not going to see an industrial policy in the way that you had historically in places like Japan and so on, or Korea, but you may see more of an industrial policy developing in the European Union in the years to come than historically has been true.
Let me do a little provocative thing. If President Macron wants to retain maximum influence in the Commission, perhaps he should just renominate Thierry Breton and let him carry on doing what he's been doing. Because he has been not a vice president or anything, but he's arguably been, I would say, the most successful individual commissioner in terms of shifting agendas and getting his stuff through. Is he going to do that? Is Mr. Macron going to actually renominate him or not? I think that's a really big question. In the scheme of things, it's a big question.
Being frivolous for a second, he might renominate him just because he knows he gets under von der Leyen's skin.
We are receiving questions from participants, and one of them, one angle is EU in the broader debate in relations with the UK and notably the US. You mentioned batteries, David. One of the questions is, how do you see EU-US relations evolving in light of the recent announcement of EU tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? And will this new approach towards China bring it closer to the US, or is it just a sign that the EU will become more protectionist?
Well, firstly, it has to be said, of course, EU-US relations will depend a lot on what happens on the other side of the Atlantic. If Trump wins, then all bets are off. But as things currently are, the battery issue is a kind of double-edged. It brings us into line with US practice, so therefore you could say it's aligning us closer to the US. But on the other side of that, it's been done in part because we don't want Chinese goods to be diverted to the EU because they're finding access to the US market more difficult. So it's not in retaliation to the US, but it's still in some senses in competition with the US, and that's just one example. I think we'll find other examples where the EU is having to react to US policy to protect itself from third countries, so not directly putting tariffs or attacking the US, but protecting itself from the fallout from US policy. But on balance, I think US-EU relations will improve under this commission and under this Parliament, and there are elements in the new Parliament that are quite anti-American, but on the whole, this will be a fairly pro-American Parliament. And if Joe Biden wins, I think his gut reaction is to be quite pro-European and to try and accommodate the Europeans. So I think you'll find EU-US dialogue developing, and I think post a presidential election, Biden himself might be less inclined to protectionism beyond the China question, and that will again make it easier for the EU and the US to work together. I don't, but this may be more hope than anything else, but I cannot see another trade or tariff war directly between the US and the EU on the horizon. Even, and also I think these elections make that less likely, not more likely.
Yeah, I agree with that. We can overdo the agonizing about EU-US relationships, I think. I mean, there's clearly a risk, a bigger risk, if President Trump returns as President Trump. But the relationship between President Trump when he was president and President Juncker was actually quite good. We have to remember that. It was perfectly smooth, really, and with blips, but it wasn't so bad. And then just a specific point on the Chinese electric vehicle tariffs. I find that perfectly normal because it's just removing, it's not really very drastic, it's just removing the quantified subsidization, unfair subsidization by China of those vehicles, targeting, one can argue, at the European market in the absence of the US market. Of course, the EU has to do that. I think the only interesting thing in terms of policy is, I'm glad that they've taken that decision, but the alternative decision would have been to let those very cheap, super cheap, ridiculously cheap, subsidized cheap cars into the EU in order to advance the green agenda. But that would have been so short term as to have huge repercussions for the European car industry, the resilience of the European economy, and it would have been absolutely wrong and ridiculous. I'm glad it wasn't considered.
We'll come back to Europe later, but we have questions from the UK. One is, why do you think the UK seems to be moving towards center-left government at a time when much Europe seems to be moving rightwards? And what does the composition of the new parliament mean for relations with the UK under Labour government?
Oh, good question. I think in terms of the first half of the question, it comes down to incumbency again, that people post-pandemic, still, although it's 2008, post the financial crash and everything else, people are still feeling worse off. They're not optimistic about the future, and they're basically voting against, with one or two outliers like Italy, against the incumbent government. And that's exactly what's happening in the UK. We've had 14 years of Conservative rule and people want a change. I live in Scotland. We've had 17 years of SNP rule, and it's clear that people are moving against the SNP. And it is about, the Labour Party's campaign slogan is change, and it's caught the mood. So I think I wouldn't put too much on at the moment about one country moving left, another country moving right, because even within the to 27, there are some who moved left and some who moved right in this election, which is why the centre held, actually, because although the right made spectacular gains in France, they lost elsewhere. What does it mean for UK-EU relations? I think that depends, again, more on the signals that come out of the UK once the Labour government's in post than the signals that come from the European Parliament or the European Commission. I think if the the UK moves forward with some very pragmatic, relatively low-key proposals and starts a dialogue with the EU and starts to slowly build new relations, then things can develop quite fast. And just to give you a couple of examples of that, the UK could propose to rejoin the Erasmus Plus scheme, or it could accept the Commission proposal on the free movement for under 25s, I think it was, but only for young people. Or we could reach a veterinary agreement to accept each other's veterinary standards, which would remove a lot of tariffs and problems at the frontier. We could continue to work, as is already to some extent in the trade and cooperation agreement. We could continue to work to move friction away in terms of customs controls and all the rest of it. So fairly low-hanging fruit, not very dramatic, but it gets the dialogue going. It shows willingness to cooperate with the European Union. And I think if the UK can engage in that sort of strategy after the election, it's too soon to tell with this European Parliament, and we don't know who's going to be in the European Commission. But looking at broadly, looking at the likely outcomes, I cannot see why they would not be receptive to such an approach.
Okay. Two remarks. I think just to remind us that the current Conservative government, or at least a predecessor of the current Conservative government, successfully took the UK out of the EU, and that has meant a hit of 5% of UK GDP on all reasonable assumptions. So, you know, that has not helped the wealth creation capacity of the United Kingdom, au contraire, as we say here in Brussels, right? So against the incumbent, I agree. And just to remind us that this is part of that analysis by at least part of the electorate. EU, UK, I'd be a little bit less optimistic in tone than you, David, because I see no evidence whatsoever that the EU 27, I don't think the European Parliament has very much to say here and there, except here and there, but the EU 27, I don't think have appetite to have the distraction of the UK again anytime soon. And I don't see that they have very much incentive either to allow what Michel Barnier used to call cherry picking on a bigger scale than we've seen hitherto. The only positive note I want to strike on that is that I see that Maroš Šefčovič is likely to come back as commissioner. So if he would personally retain his part of his present role, which is the EU leg of the interface, that would be really excellent news. So for me, it's excellent news that he would come back. It would be brilliant news if he were to retain that particular responsibility.
No, I actually agree with you entirely, Lowri, that the 27 have no great interest in lodging any initiatives or approaching the UK, which is why I think it's very much the UK has to come forward with suggestions, and they have to be win-win. They can't be, to use the old expression, cake and eat it. It can't just be things that benefit Britain. And that's, I mean, that's why I suggested those three things. I mean, Commission are interested in having free movement for European youngsters to come to the UK, and we're interested the other way around. To be honest, Commission's partly interested in that because they don't want member states to do bilateral agreements with the UK. But whatever the motive, they're interested in it. Same with Erasmus. And similarly with veterinary agreements, because it affects European companies and countries trying to import into the UK as much as it impacts on UK producers trying to sell abroad. So it's low-hanging fruit, and it's not going to change, as you say, the 5% damage to the UK economy that's happened, but it starts a dialogue and it starts us working, getting closer together. And of course, separate from this discussion, but they're already quite, I think the next Labour government will have quite intense relations about security and defence cooperation, and that will also help.
Yeah, absolutely. The main thing that UK has to offer is the defence part, which is, let's all remember, not part of the EU as such, but it can certainly play into the politics.
Coming back to the EU, I'm getting lots of questions, of course, on Green Deal, what it means for sustainability agenda. One specific question is, it's true that there has been a sustainability focus throughout all kind of legislation, touching digital files to chemicals, the fashion sector, etc., introducing sustainability reporting requirements, Green Claims Directive. Will this continue in the next mandate, with the caveat that it all will depend on who has the top job and what the Commission thinks about Green Deal going forward? But do you see this trend? And then I'll follow up with a question about consumer legislation in the new parliament.
I can start with the second half if you like, and that's I think there will be more, because the two things are linked. I think there will be the Green Deal will become to some extent more about consumers than it has been so far, and as again many people on this call will know, there's a proposed potential directive on empowering consumers in relation to the green transition, and that's about tackling greenwashing and things like ensuring that there's no planned obsolescence built into products, and more careful analysis about generic environmental claims. So more stuff about saying to the consumer, this is how you can be green, this is how we're empowering you, rather than imposing costs or anything else on you. And I think that will be an important shift of tone, because I think the EPP, for example, which started to fall out of love with the green transition towards the end of the last parliament, will find that approach more acceptable. And I think also things like new movement on digital fairness and so on, ensuring that people get better access to understand what they're being offered on platforms, that they are honest and truthful statements. I think it'd be more that sort of thing. If you like, the Green Deal might become something like a new Green Deal for consumers, rather than the putting, as you described, more burdens on producers, which was very much the tone of the previous administration.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I wonder if there isn't scope for a slight reprioritization within the overall title of Green Deal. Arguably, in this cycle, the Commission and everybody else didn't put enough emphasis on energy and climate. I mean, they wouldn't agree with that, but I think they didn't do real enough proposals that would accelerate the investment that we were talking about a little bit earlier, necessary to actually meet the climate change targets. So there is a lot of scope to do more on the energy climate change agenda for sure. And I really hope that they grasp the nettle in a bit more honest way in this cycle than they did in the last one. It surely, in Green Deal terms though, it surely is the high watermark for the biodiversity sort of dimension for Green Deal, because that added costs to farmers in a way which wasn't quantified, and the EU didn't get away with it, right? I think there is an understanding now that if we are going to advance more on the nature biodiversity type of green agenda, that we have to be a little bit more honest about the trade-offs in terms of costs, because that can be really annoying to key voters if you don't do that. I mean, some people have said to me that there was an unacknowledged piling on of 3 billion a year, not one off, to the agricultural sector out of the environmental legislation. That was never, ever said or honestly dealt with. So, I hope that the good governance dimension in terms of the future Green Deal agenda is a lot more present in this forthcoming political cycle than it was in the one that's finishing now.
It's a very slight digression, just following on from that, Lowri. It's interesting that agriculture, which is a priority in terms of the bids for committee chair, has been falling down the pecking order in the parliament for every parliament since 1979. The EPP have made it one of their top 3 choices for this parliament, which I think shows both politically they fear they're losing agricultural votes, and secondly that agriculture has not been given enough attention to in the last 5 years, and particularly, as you say, in relation to the environment and biodiversity.
Yeah, we didn't answer your question properly though. That was annoying, Coco. I would say that the legislation that you cited in the very beginning, personally, I would hope that there isn't more legislation like that, because the implementation challenge of actually just putting that into law and enforcing it for the member states now is huge, huge. I mean, of course, we need to see the legislation that's adopted implemented. And I am not 100% sure that the member states understood what they've signed up to already. So, let's get things in order, yeah?
I think that's a sentiment that would be shared by lots of our participants in the tech sector, with tons of legislation after these 5 years, huge overlap. Need to settle the dust and see what are the results. But I heard you, David, on the digital fairness and the consumer angle in the parliament. That will also have an influence on how copyright and artificial intelligence is seen also, right?
Yes, I would think so. I think this Parliament will be the one. I'm fairly certain in saying the one definite shift in this Parliament will be more in favour of protecting copyright and patents and so on. I think it will be really quite strong on that. The last Parliament wasn't that tough on that. I think this Parliament will be. AI, it's more difficult to. The Parliament itself, going back to an earlier discussion, we'll have to wait and see what the Commission brings forward in terms of artificial intelligence. And it is more difficult just on a looking at the party situation to understand what the attitude to AI will be. I think we've got to wait and see how the individuals within the political groups respond to that. So I'm dodging your question to some extent, but I'm really just not sure whether the movement will be to fully utilise it, to gung-ho, let's get an advantage over all the other competitors and make Europe a champion of this, or will the potential civil liberties issues or data protection issues or whatever, copyright protection issues, will all these come more to the fore? It is, I have to say, for me, that's an open book at the present time. I really don't know.
I would say for many, I think maybe the way forward will be looking at verticals. What are the areas impacted by AI and trying to solve that vertically? But let's see. We're wrapping up and we're close to 2 o'clock here in Brussels. I have a question, which is, it's a good roundup actually. Which are the most urgent areas in which the new Commission should work on to ensure its long-term competitiveness in front of its main rivals? Would you like to adventure?
I might leave that one to Lowri to kick off if she's all right with that.
I'm going to repeat to get more emphasis. Electrification, grid, because unless we solve our energy input dilemma, we will not have an AI industry or significant manufacturing industry and low prices for our consumers and voters going forward. This.
Yeah, I would add to that food security, and food pricing, and that's at 2 levels, making sure that the farmer gets a fair price for his or her production, and that the consumer gets food at a price they can afford. I think that should be a high priority. I think solving, and it won't be solved, but finding a balance is maybe a better way of putting it, between not being naive on trade to make sure that we are as open as we can be, and I'm generally a free trader, but to be as open as we can be, but not to be naive, and to protect ourselves when we have to, but only when we have to. And I think if the next Parliament and Commission can find a balance between those two very difficult things, it will do both European producers and European consumers in the long run a lot of good.
Do you think that that's also a question that has come up quite significantly today? Do you think that the members, MEPs from non-attached parties, will have a real influence in the final outcome and the political distribution in the Parliament?
The non-attached, the people who don't eventually join a group, will have no influence. I mean, if you're a member of what's called the non-Escree group in the Parliament, you have virtually, no, I wouldn't even say virtually, you have no influence in the way that Parliament operates or the legislative process. But I think what you're getting at is that it's reckoned there are about 40-45 people who have yet to make up their mind what groups they will join, and they could have potentially a lot of influence. Going back to the point I made about the Hunt, at the moment, Renew have 82 members, I think, at the current projection, and the ECR 80. If 3 people joined the ECR out of that 40 and didn't join, and nobody joined Renew, ECR would move up the list, and in my calculations, they would have the 4th choice of committee chair if that happened, which would make them potentially hold one of the key posts in the Parliament. Similarly, if The Slovenians are allowed into the, the socialist group expelled because of what happened at the national level. They're Slovenian members. If the Slovenian members are allowed back into the socialist group, which might happen because the individual MEPs from Slovenia are not identical to their government, the socialists can start to grow closer to the EPP in terms of influence. And again, rather than getting second and sixth choice of committee chair, they could get second and fourth or fifth. So the whole cascade changes, and these 40 odd people who have yet to make up their mind could really have a big influence on the shape of the next parliament.
I wouldn't dare to add anything to that, David, to be honest. Would you, Lowri?
Not at all.
Okay. I see no other questions. I think we've covered more or less everything, one way or the other. Thank you very much for joining. I think it was said in the beginning, but this is the first of a series of Shearwater webinars where we will try to deep dive into several topics, elections in the EU, UK, trade relations going forward, looking at US also. So please come back to us if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to hear from you. You know where to find us now. Thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon.